Her hands appear first. Two black hands, broad, with nails trimmed short. They grip the aluminum handles of the wheelchairs firmly. Her fingers aren't trembling. The skin is thick, calloused, marked by years of labor. But there is something serene in that grip. The camera is so close we can almost hear the breathing. Behind her, chaos whispers in silence. Broken glass on the floor reflects the cold light of the hallway. A crib is tipped on its side, as if something had ripped it from its place with violence. Torn curtains hang from the window. No one is screaming in this moment. It is the silence that hurts. The camera pans up slowly. It passes broad shoulders covered by an immaculate white apron, moves up a firm neck and finally reaches her face. Elise. Her eyes are fixed, pointed at something we cannot see yet. There is no panic in her face. There is determination. There is a decision already made, etched into every line of her forehead. She advances with the empty chairs. Every step is sure on the hardwood floor that creaks beneath her feet. The sound echoes through the house. At the entrance of the bedroom, two shadows rush past. A blonde nanny, her uniform torn at the sleeve, brings a hand to her face as if she's taken a deep scratch. She doesn't look back. The other nanny, younger, trips over her own haste to leave. We hear her voice, hoarse and trembling with fear. They aren't children, they're demons, I swear they're demons. The sound of their footsteps descending the main staircase, every step banging like a gunshot. The front door opens and slams with violence. Elise keeps moving forward. She doesn't avert her gaze, she doesn't hesitate. She pushes the empty chairs toward the staircase that leads to the second floor. Her lips move, but there is no sound. Maybe she is praying. Maybe she is just breathing. The camera follows her as she disappears down the hallway, a dark silhouette against the cream-colored walls, until nothing remains but the sound of wheelchair tires rolling against the hardwood floor. The therapy room is on the second floor, in the west wing. The door is closed. There is no sound on the other side. Anyone entering here would know that this is a place where hope came to die a long time ago. The entire house is a lie masquerading as luxury. Gilded frames on the walls hold photographs of a couple smiling at a luxury resort, in private gardens, on yachts that cost more than the lifetime earnings of hundreds of people. Everything is too new, too shiny, too empty. The abstract paintings hanging up were bought by the square foot, not for meaning. The Italian furniture looks like it's waiting to be used by someone who actually knows how to live. The therapy room is different. It is filled with machines blinking with red and green lights. There is a yellow oxygen cylinder in the corner, the rubber tubing coiled like a sleeping snake. Two special mattresses occupy the space, one blue, one white. Above each one, there is a series of levers and chains hanging from metal structures. On the wall, a chart displays pulse patterns. On the shelf, bottles of medicine with names that sound like machine codes. Baclofen, tizanidine, topiramate. It is a room that costs everything and cures nothing. Claire is lying on the blue mattress. She is 10 years old. Her hair is light brown, tied in a loose ponytail that has partially fallen out. Her body is thin, so thin you can count the ribs beneath the pale pink pajamas. Her eyes, however, are alive. Extremely alive. They follow the flight of a yellow butterfly that entered through the open window. Her eyes move with total attention focused on that insect. It is the only movement her body can make with precision. Everything else is a prison. Sophie is on the white mattress. She is the same age, has the same twin features, the same imprisoned body, but her eyes are closed. Her breathing is heavier. In her inner room, where no one can enter, she is somewhere very different from this cold white room. They have cerebral palsy, the kind that doesn't get better, the kind that gets worse, the kind that steals very slowly every movement a child should have the right to. Yesterday, Claire had a cramp. It started without warning, as they always do. A tremor in her feet. Then the toes began to curl inward like claws. Then the entire calf hardened like wood. The previous nanny, the one with the impeccable uniform, just adjusted a pillow under her leg and left the room, closing the door so she wouldn't hear the small sounds of pain that Claire couldn't even scream out properly. It took 15 minutes for the spasm to stop. Claire spent the next 2 hours simply breathing, in a cold sweat, trying to recover the sensation of being alive. Their mother, Vivian, was in her office downstairs, talking to her hedge fund manager about a property in the Hamptons. She didn't know her daughters were suffering. Maybe she didn't want to know. Their father, Robert, was in his boardroom, in an office miles away. He was the type of man whose shoulders get tenser as the years pass. Everything to him was competition. Everything was movement up or falling down. His daughters were a footnote in his ledger of failures. He visited them on Sundays, stayed 15 minutes, handed over a doll that neither could hold, and went back to the world where things made sense. The therapy room cost $5,000 a month just in equipment rental. Robert had the money for this. What he didn't have was the face of someone who could look at his daughters without feeling angry at them for existing like this. Vivian had different ideas about how her daughters should exist. She started interviewing caregivers precisely 3 days after the previous nanny fled through the front door. She was sitting in the living room, the most formal one in the house, the one with the sofa no one could sit on because it damaged the leather. She was in a real leather chair, back straight, hands in her lap. The candidate nannies came from an agency. All of them had impeccable references. All of them had proven experience. All of them looked at the resume written in Vivian's hand, as if those were the final orders from God. "They cannot leave the room," Vivian said to the first candidate, a 50-year-old woman in an immaculate uniform. "The neighbors cannot see them. You understand this, yes? My husband has an image to maintain in this town." The woman swallowed hard and said yes. She lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, Vivian found her sitting on the floor of the therapy room, holding Claire's hand and weeping silently. They fired her the same day. The second nanny lasted 5 days. She tried to introduce play activities in the room, brought a stereo, played classical music for the girls. Vivian came down the stairs like an avalanche. "This is a clinic, not a classroom for normal children," she said, using the word normal as if it were a poison that left a taste in the mouth. The nanny left 3 days later. The third nanny was the one with the torn uniform. No one knew exactly what Claire or Sophie did. She just ran up the stairs and declared that the girls had attacked her, that they were violent, that she couldn't work in such a hostile environment. Vivian believed it immediately. At least this absolved her of any guilt. If the girls were dangerous, then the problem wasn't hers. It was their problem. "I need someone now," Vivian said over the phone to the agency. "Someone who doesn't give up easily. Someone who knows what they're doing." The agency sent Elise because they had no one else. All the other resumes had some issue. Elise was the default option, the desperate option. She arrived on a Wednesday in the late afternoon. She wore a white uniform that had been ironed with care. Her shoes were black, old, but clean. She carried a small plastic suitcase with her belongings. Her documents were all in order. She had experience listed in 3 previous households, all references that Vivian made a point to check. "Why did you leave your previous job?" asked Vivian. "The child became independent," Elise answered simply. "She didn't need me anymore." Vivian heard this as Elise being too dumb to understand that her own daughter would never be independent. This made the woman comfortable. A nanny who had no hope was a controllable nanny. "The children have special needs," Vivian said, using the euphemism rich people use when they can't say the true word out loud. "They need specific care. They need routine. They need discretion. No one can know about their problems." "Can I meet them first?" asked Elise. The question was so simple that Vivian almost didn't hear it. Usually, the nannies just accepted the orders. They signed papers. They received training. No one asked to meet the children as if they were people, as if knowing them mattered. "The room is on the 2nd floor, Vivian said, standing up with the feeling that she had wasted too much time on this. Elise went up the stairs in silence. She arrived at the therapy room and stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking. The machines blinked. The oxygen cylinder purred softly. Claire followed the yellow butterfly with her eyes. Sophie breathed slowly under a wool blanket. Elise entered the room, closed the door behind her. and did something no other person had done since the girls arrived in that white prison room. She sat on the floor, not on the sofa, not on the hard plastic chair near the door. She sat on the cold hardwood floor, bending her knees to place herself exactly at Claire's eye level. "Hi," said Elise. Her voice was low. It was calm. It was as if she were telling a secret just to Claire. "My name is Elise. And you?" Claire couldn't speak. Her mouth didn't obey the way she wanted it to obey, but her eyes moved. They left the yellow butterfly and landed on Elise. There was surprise there. There was interest. There was, for the first time in many months, the sensation of being seen. Claire's index finger moved, just a millimeter, just enough for Elise to notice. Downstairs in the office, Vivian was at her computer when she saw Elise come down the stairs. The black woman had a serene expression. She walked as if she had just executed an action, not as if she had failed. "They seem like good children," Elise said. Vivian smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had just found a tool she believed she could use, a woman who didn't have enough formal education to question things, a woman who was desperate enough to accept what no one else would accept. "You start Monday," said Vivian. "I start now," replied Elise. Vivian blinked. No one had ever contested a date with her. "What do you mean now?" "Now," Elise repeated calmly. "They have already spent too much time waiting." In that moment, Vivian made her first mistake. She believed she had hired an employee. She had no idea she had let someone into her house who was about to offer her daughters exactly what she herself would never give them. Money doesn't offer it. Status doesn't offer it. Only people offer it. And Elise had a lot to offer. It's sickening to see someone treated like this, isn't it? To see innocent children, trapped in bodies that don't obey them, neglected by those who should protect them. If you also think that justice needs to be served, that someone like Elise should be by Claire and Sophie's side, smash that like button now to support these girls who deserve so much genuine love and care. Elise's first days in the house were a visual lie. She took care of the girls, talked to them, tried to create spaces of peace inside that white room. Claire smiled when she saw her enter. Sophie opened her eyes a little faster when she heard her voice. It was like watching two flowers starting to turn toward a light that had finally arrived. But the real routine began when the nurse arrived. His name was Marcus. He was 45, had a beard he didn't bother to comb correctly, and eyes that never looked at the girls as people. He looked at them as machines that needed to be fixed, or more precisely, as machines that needed to serve the purpose of the parents' money. The first time Elise saw him, he was unloading boxes of equipment in the hallway. Machines she didn't recognize. Electrodes, cables. Metal boxes with control knobs that looked like torture instruments pulled from a century no one wanted to remember existed. "What is this?" asked Elise. "Neuromuscular electrical stimulation," Marcus replied without looking up. "It's going to help reactivate the girls' neurons. It will improve their mobility. It will produce results." The word results came out of his mouth like it was a commercial term, as if the children were a financial investment that needed to yield dividends. The first session happened on a Tuesday morning. Elise was explicitly forbidden from being present. Vivian closed the bedroom door and left a "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging. Marcus went in with his box of instruments. Elise stayed outside, in the hallway, and listened. The sounds that came out of that room weren't therapy sounds. They were sounds of suffering. Claire started first, a sharp scream tearing from her throat as if it were being ripped out by force. Then Sophie, as if responding, in a different frequency, weaker but equally desperate. Elise put her hand on the doorknob. Her fingers touched the cold metal. She took a deep breath, and then she opened the door. What she saw was this. Claire was lying on the mattress, with electrodes stuck to her muscles. Wires came out of her body as if she were a marionette connected to a death machine. Sophie had the same treatment. Marcus was sitting in a chair, controlling a device that blinked with red numbers. Every time he pressed a button, the girls shook involuntarily. "Get out of here," Marcus said without even looking at her. "This hurts," said Elise. "They can't speak correctly." "How do you know it hurts?" "Because I'm listening." Marcus stood up. He was a big man. He had the kind of body that comes from years of eating red meat and drinking too much beer. He approached Elise and his voice dropped low, like a warning coming very close to becoming a threat. "You were hired to take care of them, not to question the medical treatment. If you have a problem with this, the door is downstairs." Elise left the room, closed the door, leaned her back against the frame. The screams continued for another 20 minutes. When Marcus left, the girls were sweating, trembling, their eyes red from crying they couldn't control. That night, Elise was confronted. Vivian called her into her office, a place where Elise didn't like to be because everything there was hard and cold and designed to make a person feel small. "Marcus said you questioned his authority," Vivian said. "That is torture," Elise replied. Vivian smiled, not a smile that meant she found this funny, a smile that meant she was about to exercise power over someone who was disposable. "My husband pays for Marcus to produce results. He is a qualified professional. If you can't understand this, maybe you aren't the right person for this job. No one qualified would do that. You are here out of desperation, Elise, not by choice. Remember that." The words hung in the air like gaseous poison. That night, when Elise lay in bed in her small room on the 3rd floor, she cried for the first time since she had arrived. She didn't cry for herself. She cried because she knew there was no escape, that the girls were trapped in a type of prison that no law could define, that the cruelty of those who created them was so systematic, so integrated into the routine, that it had become invisible. But Elise wasn't the type to give up. The next day, she tried to take the girls to the garden. It was a sunny day. The light streamed through the windows of the house as if offering a gift no one wanted to receive. Elise pushed the girls' wheelchairs toward the stairs, went down to the 1st floor and opened the doors leading to the back garden. Vivian appeared like a ghost. "What are you doing?" "Taking the girls to get some sun," Elise replied. "It's healthy. It's important." "No, the neighbors might see." "There are no neighbors on this side of the house." "It doesn't matter. Go back." And Elise had to go back. She pushed the chairs back up the stairs, watching through the glass as the sun disappeared behind the brick walls. Claire looked back as she was being taken away. Her eyes said everything. There was hope there, and Vivian had destroyed it with one word. That week, Elise sent an anonymous email to Child Protective Services. She described the treatments. She described the routine. She used words like neglect and physical abuse and social isolation. She sent it from a public computer at a library 20 miles away. 3 days later, Robert called her into his office. He rarely came home during the day. This was a sign that something had broken. "You reported my family," he said. It wasn't a question. "I reported what I am seeing. Do you know what happens to people who don't know their place? They disappear. I have contacts everywhere in this city. Contacts who can make a background check simply stop existing. Contacts who can ensure you never work in another house again." His words were spoken in a calm tone. It was that calm that comes before a hurricane destroys everything it meets. "But," Robert continued, "you are the only person the girls accept right now, and they are improving according to Marcus. So you are going to stay. You are going to do your job. You are going to shut your mouth. And you are going to pray that nothing goes wrong. Because if it does, it will be your fault." Elise left that office with the knowledge that she was trapped too, not in a white room, but in a prison made of words, threats, and the impossibility of leaving without abandoning the girls. The weeks passed. The routine established itself as a ritual of pain. In the morning, Marcus came with his electrodes. The girls screamed. Elise listened from the hallway and kept her hands busy with tasks that meant nothing. In the afternoon, she tried to comfort the girls, clean off the residue of sweat, give them water, whisper stories that no one could hear completely. Claire shut down. Her eyes no longer followed Elise around the room. Sophie started closing her eyes for longer and longer periods, as if she were trying to escape to a place where no one could follow. The small progress Elise had made disappeared like snow in the sun. It was a Thursday when the crisis happened. Elise had arrived in the room in the morning to find Sophie breathing strangely. Not fast. Strange. As if it were coming from very deep. As if the girl's body were starting to give up. She looked for Marcus. He wasn't in the house. She looked for Vivian. She was on a video call with the investment manager. She looked for Robert. He had left early. Sophie began to make sounds that weren't words. Her body went rigid. White foam began to spill from her lips. Her eyes rolled back, leaving only the whites visible. Seizure. Elise had seen this once before, with her grandmother, many years ago. Her grandmother had survived, but only because her grandmother had known exactly what to do. Elise laid Sophie on her side, the recovery position. She kept her there, supporting her head with her hand. She whispered words her grandmother had whispered to her. Words about being present, about not being afraid, about keeping the body calm. The seizure lasted 5 minutes. It felt like 5 hours. When it ended, Sophie was unconscious. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse was weak, she was pale. Elise ran down the stairs screaming. Vivian disconnected her call. Robert was returning from the street. An ambulance was called. Sophie was taken to the hospital with sirens blaring. She survived. The doctors couldn't understand why. They said Sophie should be dead. That being placed on her side during the seizure was what saved her life. That if she had aspirated her own vomit, it would have been the end. Robert heard this and looked at Elise as if blaming her for not letting his daughter die. As if her life, the problematic life, the life that cost money, was a burden he preferred not to carry. 2 days later, Sophie came back from the hospital. She was weak, much weaker than before. Elise placed her on her white mattress and began the recovery process. Warm baths, slow hydration, whispered words. It was while cleaning the vomit that had dried a little on the floor that Elise found it. A white fragment, small, hard. That wasn't from the food Sophie had ingested. It was a piece of a pill. Elise placed it in the palm of her hand. Her heart began to beat slower, and then it began to beat faster. Because Elise knew, as sure as she knew her own name, that Sophie hadn't taken that pill. That someone had placed it there. That someone had deliberately provoked that crisis. She raised her eyes toward the door. Marcus was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame. He was smiling. It wasn't a smile that expressed joy. It was a smile that expressed knowledge of a secret she couldn't tell, of a truth no one would believe. His smile said everything. It said, "This was my fault, but you will never be able to prove it. This was deliberate, but no one will believe you. You are here only because no one else wants this job, and I am here because the parents pay me well. And they prefer a nurse who knows how to keep children submissive over a nurse who knows how to treat them well." Elise felt the pill fragment burn in her palm, as if it were evidence that could incriminate her, not Marcus. The pill fragment remained in Elise's hand all night. She didn't throw it away. She didn't show it to anyone. She kept it in a handkerchief, kept the handkerchief in a wooden box under her mattress. It was evidence that no one would believe, of a crime no one would recognize as a crime. But now Elise knew. And knowing was different from suspecting. The house had a file room on the 3rd floor, next to the guest room no one ever used. No one had explicitly forbidden Elise from entering there, which meant it was one of those places where prohibitions were simply assumed. It was for invisible people not to go. Elise entered on a Sunday night. Robert and Vivian were watching a movie in the living room. Marcus had left earlier. The girls were sleeping after a reinforced dose of their night medications, the ones that kept them unconscious and docile. The files were organized by year and by type. She looked for medical records. She found a folder marked Claire and Sophie, neurological follow-up. The date was from 4 years ago, a year after the initial diagnosis of cerebral palsy. The first document was a report from a neurologist whose signature was illegible, but the content was crystal clear. The report said that the girls had a specific form of CP that was, according to the prognosis, highly responsive to adequate therapeutic stimulation. That with the correct treatment over years, there was a significant probability of partial recovery of movement. That the prognosis was favorable if the treatment was early and consistent and humanized. Humanized. The word was underlined in red. There were handwritten notes in the margins. Whose handwriting, Elise didn't know. But someone had written, "Improve fast with appropriate stimulation. Possible recovery of up to 60% mobility in 2 to 3 years with proper protocol." Then, there was another folder, more recent, dated 2 years ago. The same neurologist had done a re-evaluation. His report was different. He said the girls showed no response to treatment, that the prognosis had worsened, that he recommended palliative care and comfort only. Elise compared the two evaluations side by side. The first report described girls with potential. The second report described girls without hope. What had changed between these 2 years? Nothing that wasn't deliberate. She looked for more. She found payment receipts for Marcus. The amounts were higher than a normal nurse's salary. There were notes next to the values, desired result, and protocol maintenance. There was also an insurance policy. 2 policies, actually. One for each girl. Each policy had a value of $3 million, payable in case of death by natural causes or accident. Elise read the dates. The policies had been taken out right after the girls received the CP diagnosis, when there was still hope, when there was still treatment available. Her eyes went over the figures multiple times. $6 million. This was what the girls were worth. Not alive and improving. Dead and cashed out. She put the documents back in their places, carefully, as if by leaving them intact she could pretend she hadn't discovered anything, as if pretending were enough. She went down the stairs like a ghost, passed through the living room unseen, went up to the girls' room. Claire was awake. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, that look Elise had learned to recognize as total consciousness inside a body that couldn't move. Elise sat down beside her. "You're awake," she whispered. Claire's eyes moved. They found Elise's eyes, blinked. 1 blink for yes, 2 blinks for no. It was the code Elise had created alone, a language only they shared. Elise had started bringing a communication board into the room that she had made herself, with white paper and letters drawn with black pen. At each letter she pointed. Claire looked intensely when it was the right one. It was slow. It was frustrating. But it was communication. "Do you want to talk to me?" asked Elise. 1 blink. "Yes." Elise took the board, began to point at letters. C-E-N. The letter N. Elise stopped, looked at Claire. She was blinking urgently, with pain in her look. "Do you want me to continue?" asked Elise. 1 blink. "Yes," Elise continued. T-I no. She stopped again. No. Are you saying center, centimeter, century? But Claire was blinking frantically. Her entire body seemed to be trying to leave the mattress through her determination. Elise went back. She must have started pointing again. S-A. Elise saw Claire's eyes fix with precision. F-E. It didn't move yet, so she continued. T-Y. Safety. Claire had spelled safety. Elise let the board drop. Her heart began to beat so fast it seemed her chest would explode. "Safety?" she repeated. 1 blink. "About you two? About the insurance?" asked Elise. 1 blink. "Yes, yes, yes." "You know?" whispered Elise. Claire's eyes filled with tears. Tears that couldn't be wiped away because her hands couldn't move. Tears that just ran down the side of her face like rain on a window pane. In that moment, Elise understood. Claire had listened to the parents' conversations. Claire had understood. Claire knew from the beginning that she was being slowly sacrificed on the altar of gold. "You aren't guilty," said Elise. "Neither of you is guilty." She picked up the board again, pointed at more letters. Elise pointed. C-H-A-N-G-E change. She continued. L-E-A-V-E leave. And then H H-E-L-P, help. Claire blinked for every letter as if she were using all the force of her will to cross the dark night. And when Elise finished, Claire did something she hadn't done in months. She moved her finger, just a millimeter. But it was a voluntary, controlled, directed movement. It was a movement of hope. The following days were an exercise in being alive while feeling dead inside. Elise took care of the girls, as always, received orders from Vivian, heard Claire and Sophie's screams during Marcus's sessions, cleaned up the residue of suffering, whispered comfort that sounded empty even to her own ears. But at night, she went back to the records, photographed everything with her old phone, saved the images in an encrypted folder no one could access, built a mental map of the crime that was being committed in silence, with documents, with signatures, with a lot of money and zero guilt. The truth established itself in her body like a disease. The truth was this: Claire and Sophie's parents didn't want them to live. They wanted them to die at the right time when the insurance could be paid, when no one could question it. And they had hired Marcus to guarantee that this happened. And she was trapped. Trapped because leaving would mean abandoning the girls. Trapped because no one would believe a nanny against a rich couple. Trapped because she had signed a contract that said she was responsible for their safety. And if something happened, she would be the one going to jail. She was trapped exactly as well as Claire and Sophie. Only her cell had the shape of an obligation. It was a Thursday when Vivian called her. "We're going on a trip," she said. "When?" asked Elise. "Sunday, 1 week, St. Bart's. We need time for ourselves. You will stay with the girls." "And Marcus?" "Marcus is coming 3 times a week. The rest of the time you handle it." Elise felt something in her chest tighten. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. It was the sensation of seeing a trap closing around her. "It might be that they need medical attention," said Elise. Vivian looked at her in a way that suggested she had just said something stupid. "Then you call the ambulance. You document everything. You ensure that nothing bad is your fault." The words were spoken with such clarity, such objectivity, that Elise almost laughed. Because Vivian had literally described the trap. She had left the door open and then said, "Look, it's here. Here's the mousetrap. Get inside." "Understood," said Elise. On Sunday, Robert and Vivian left for the airport in a taxi. They took suitcases that suggested a week of luxury in a 5-star hotel. Vivian kissed her daughters on the forehead without really touching them. Robert didn't even do that. He just found a reason to be looking at his cell phone at the moment he should have been saying goodbye. When Vivian's eyes met Elise's before leaving the house, she smiled. It wasn't a bon voyage smile. It was a smile that said, "Now we will see what you are made of." It was during the goodbye that Vivian dropped her purse. It was a designer bag, the kind that cost more than Elise's monthly rent. It fell open on the foyer floor, and from inside it, a glass bottle with white pills rolled out. Vivian saw it, looked at Elise. Her eyes moved between the bottle and Elise's face. A calculation passed behind that look, a decision. And then, delicately, she bent down and put the bottle in Elise's bag. "How strange," said Vivian. "How did that get in there?" "I don't know," replied Elise. "Well, now it's in your bag. Be careful. Very potent sedatives. Could be dangerous if someone took them without a prescription." The threat was as clear as if Vivian had written it in blood on the wall. Robert appeared with the final bags. The taxi honked. They left. And Elise remained alone, not completely alone. There were Claire and Sophie lying on their mattresses, conscious of everything. There was the bottle of sedatives now in her bag. And there was the week ahead, that week where anything could happen. Anything, any emergency, any crisis. And when it came, Marcus would be there to ensure it was as severe as possible. And then Marcus would disappear. And when the police arrived, they would find a negligent nanny with a bottle of potent sedatives in her bag, ready to be blamed. Elise looked at Claire. Claire looked at her. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them could. But something had changed in that room. The temperature seemed to have dropped. The light seemed dimmer. Time seemed to be accelerating. as if the universe knew something was about to happen. Elise put her hand on Claire's chest. "I am going to protect you," she whispered. "I promise." Claire blinked, a firm blink, a blink that said, "I believe you." And in that moment, Elise made a decision that would change everything. A decision that would put her at risk, a decision that could destroy her life. But that could save 2 small lives. It's sickening, isn't it? To see such an obvious trap being set. To see a mother planting evidence against a woman who is just trying to protect her children. To see innocent kids being slowly prepped to be sacrificed for their parents' life insurance. If you also think this is abominable, that Elise deserves to have someone on her side, that Claire and Sophie deserve to live, smash that like button now to support this brave woman who is about to challenge an entire system to do what is right. The first night alone was silent in a way that seemed unnatural. Without Robert's footsteps banging on the hardwood. Without Vivian's voice on the phone. Without the sound of electrodes being connected. Just the whisper of the house breathing in its own rhythm. Elise stayed awake. She sat in a chair next to Claire's mattress, her eyes open, her hands resting but ready. She knew the pattern now. She knew Marcus would come the next morning. She knew he would expect to find the house empty to do what had been planned from the start. She knew he would come to kill. The morning arrived gray and humid. Marcus entered without knocking, as always. He carried his box of instruments, but this time there was something different. Something he carried inside his white coat. A syringe, a large needle, a vial of colorless liquid. "Good morning," said Marcus, his voice that same voice that never had tone, that sounded like a machine learning to speak. "Good morning," replied Elise. She was standing, blocking the path to Sophie's mattress. "Get out of the way," said Marcus. "No," replied Elise. Marcus put the box on the floor. His face didn't change. Men like this, men who had sold their souls for money, didn't need to make grimaces. Their faces had learned to be professional masks. "You want to be a hero?" asked Marcus. "I want to be human," replied Elise. Marcus advanced. He was a big man, as had already been established. He had weight, he had strength. He had the certainty that a woman wouldn't be a problem. But Marcus didn't know that Elise had grown up in a neighborhood where women learned to fight early. That Elise had spent 2 years in a martial arts gym before being hired as a nurse. That her body knew techniques her mind had buried deeply. Those techniques one never uses when one is a person trying to be good. Marcus reached out to grab Elise's arm. Elise spun. Her hip met his. Her body moved as if she were dancing, but it was a war dance. Marcus was lifted off the floor, his feet leaving contact with the wood, his body describing an arc in the air. He fell with full force on his back. The air left his lungs with a sound that sounded like breaking glass. His hand opened. The syringe fell to the floor and rolled under a table. Elise walked calmly to the door and closed it. Then calmly, she sat on Marcus's chest, immobilizing his arms with her knees. Her hand went down to his throat and stayed there, not squeezing, just touching, letting him know she could squeeze. "You are going to get out of my life," said Elise. "You are going to get out of their lives. Or you are going to die in this room." Marcus gasped. His face turned red. He tried to move, but Elise was faster, more agile, more motivated. He wasn't a warrior. He was just a man who had learned to be cruel because cruelty was easy and well paid. "They will never walk," Marcus said through the gasping. "Never. It's genetic. Impossible." "You are a liar," replied Elise. "Ask them," wheezed Marcus, his face starting to turn purple. "Ask if they didn't tell you it's impossible." Elise backed away. Let Marcus breathe. The man went down the stairs, limping, gasping, and left through the front door without looking back. No one had seen him arrive. No one would see him leave. Elise breathed heavily. Her muscles trembled not from fatigue, but from adrenaline. She had opened a door she had locked a long time ago. She had allowed a version of herself, a version that was fierce, that was capable, that was dangerous, to wake up. She walked over to the communication board. "Claire," she said, "I need you to tell me the truth." Claire blinked. "Yes." Elise began to point. "L-I-E. Lie?" Claire blinked. "Yes, yes. Yes, multiple blinks. Marcus is lying? Asked Elise. A strong blink. Yes. You can get better? Asked Elise. A blink. Yes. How do you know this? Elise pointed the board again. Let Claire spell her own truth. A-C-C-I-D-E-N-T. Accident. Elise continued pointing. Let the 10-year-old girl tell the story no one had allowed her to tell. F-I-R-E. Fire. B-E-A-C-H. Beach. H-O-U-S-E. House. And then the words that changed everything. N-O-T-A-N-A-C-C-I-D-E-N-T. Not an accident. Elise sat on the edge of the mattress. Her eyes didn't blink. Her body was very quiet. What? She whispered. And Claire, using only her eyes, told the story that had remained locked in her body. The fire had started in the kitchen. It had started deliberately. The parents were facing enormous debts. Their companies were failing. Their investments were disappearing. They needed money. And the beach house was worth a lot of money. They had planned to leave the girls with a nanny while they were out. The nanny had canceled. They should have rescheduled the trip. Instead, they left the girls sleeping and started the fire that would destroy the house and collect the insurance. Claire had woken up with the smell of smoke. Sophie was still sleeping. Claire had tried to move. She couldn't. She had tried to call for the nanny. No one came. The fire had spread. The heat had arrived. And when finally the firefighters entered, both girls had inhaled toxic smoke. Both had suffered neurological damage not from the heat, but from the lack of oxygen. Neurological damage that could have been reversible, or at least significantly improved, if it had been treated with care, with patience, with love. But the fire had caused something more important than physical damage. It had caused consciousness. Claire and Sophie understood in that moment that their parents had tried to kill them, that their initial suffering hadn't been an accident of God, but a deliberate choice by human beings who called them mother and father. And since then, they had lived with the knowledge that their prison was self-constructed by the very people who should have saved them. Elise remained silent for a long time. Then she picked up the board again. "You know I'm going to help, right?" she asked. A blink. Yes. 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 "And you know this is going to cost everything I have?" asked Elise. A blink. Yes. "Okay," said Elise. "Then I'm going to tell you who I am." Elise sat on the floor, rested her back against the wall, and began to speak. She had been a physical therapist in a public hospital. She had worked for 7 years, helping people no one else could help. She had loved her job the way people love that which gives them meaning. But then there was a boy, a rich boy, the son of an even richer doctor. The boy had suffered an accident. Elise had been assigned to be part of his recovery team. She had discovered an error in the treatment plan, an error that would have caused permanent damage. Elise had tried to alert the senior doctor. The doctor was the boy's father. He was a man who didn't believe a public hospital PT could be right and him wrong. She had insisted. The doctor had threatened. She had insisted more. In the end, the error had been corrected. The boy had gotten well, but the doctor, whose ego had been wounded, had done something that was technically possible in a system where power was more important than truth. He had accused Elise of negligence, of having assaulted the patient, of having attempted sabotage. He had falsified records. He had convinced the hospital administration. He had ensured Elise's career was destroyed. She had lost her license. She had lost her job. She had lost her identity in a way few people can comprehend. But she hadn't lost her knowledge. She hadn't lost her skill. And more importantly, she hadn't lost her rage. When she had heard rumors about a wealthy family that was sabotaging the treatment of their disabled daughters, when she had seen a vacancy advertised in that specific house, Elise had applied with a fake resume. She had entered that house not by chance, but by purpose. Her plan wasn't just to care for the girls. It was to collect proof. It was to document every act of neglect, every act of cruelty, every act of sabotage. It was to gather enough evidence so that no one could deny the truth again. And now she had everything. Photos of the medical records, videos of the e-stim sessions, the planted pill bottle, the testimony of 2 children who perfectly understood what had happened to them. Elise stood up, took her phone, dialed a number she had memorized a long time ago. A voice answered, a voice of someone who had been waiting. "It's time," said Elise. "Bring the team, bring the police, bring everything you need to bring." She hung up, and in that moment, very far from there, sirens began to sound. Soft at first, then louder, then so loud they seemed to be tearing the air. The sirens were coming. The sirens arrived in waves. First one, then 2 more. The police cruisers blocked the entrance of the house as if they were sealing a tomb that had finally been discovered. Behind them, a van with a news channel logo. The cameras came out first. The reporters came out next. And then the officers, with their uniforms and their authority, began to climb the stairs. Elise met them at the door. She wasn't running. She wasn't crying. She just made way for them to enter, for them to see, for them to document everything that had happened in that cold, white room. A detective came down the stairs carrying the bottle of sedatives. "Whose bag was this in?" she asked. "In mine," replied Elise, and pointed to Vivian's bag, which was still in the foyer. But she planted it. The officers opened the designer bag. They found documents. They found receipts. They found everything a guilty person forgets to destroy because they believe their wealth makes them invisible. While this was happening, Robert and Vivian's car pulled into the driveway. They were returning from St. Bart's with suitcases full of purchases no one would buy for them again. The car door opened. The parents of the house stepped out. Vivian saw the cruisers and stopped. Her body froze in the same spot she had frozen when she saw Elise question her months ago. Robert got out too. His face went through several expressions simultaneously. Surprise, incomprehension, and then very slowly, comprehension. "What is the meaning of this?" asked Robert, using that tone rich men use when they believe words alone can dissolve authority. "The meaning is that you are under arrest," replied the detective, "for suspicion of gross negligence, child abuse, insurance fraud, and attempted murder." Vivian fainted, literally fell sideways like a felled tree. Robert tried to run but was intercepted by 2 officers who immediately understood him as someone who had done this many times before in his mind, but had never had the courage to execute it in reality. The reporters were recording everything. The cameras captured every detail. Vivian on the ground, Robert being placed in cuffs, and then the detective holding the bottle of sedatives, showing it to the camera. "This bottle was found on the property during investigation," she said. "Contains a controlled prescription sedative. Doses potent enough to put a child in a coma." Vivian opened her eyes, saw the camera, saw the detective, saw her life crumbling in real time. She tried to get up, tried to speak, tried to do something to save herself. "I never," she started. "Talk to your lawyer," interrupted the detective. But before Vivian could be taken away, one thing happened. One thing no one had planned. One thing that came out of the white room on the 2nd floor. Elise had brought Claire and Sophie to the window overlooking the foyer. She hadn't forced them. She had just asked if they wanted to see, if they wanted to be present for their own rescue. Claire had blinked. Yes. Sophie had blinked. Yes. Elise had positioned them where they could see and be seen. And while Vivian was on the ground, while Robert was being taken away, while the cameras rolled, Elise whispered, "It's time for you to say no." Claire, the older twin, the one who had spelled safety and accident and truth, gathered all the years of trapped muscles and repressed nerves and did something the doctors had said was impossible. She turned her head to the side, intentional, controlled, rejecting. And Sophie, seeing her sister do this, gathered her own strength and did the same. The 2 girls, side by side in the window, turned their heads away from their parents in a gesture that was too small to be a miracle, but too big to be ignored. Vivian saw it. Her eyes met Claire's eyes. And in that moment, she finally understood the size of her own loss. Not a loss of money or freedom, but a loss that was irreparable. The loss of the chance to love her daughters, the loss of being loved by them. She began to scream, screams that came out of her throat without words, just raw sound of someone whose life had ended, even if her heart still beat. The reporters captured everything, the mothers screaming, the parents being taken away, the two girls in the window refusing to acknowledge them. The image would be shown on the news that night. It would be shared millions of times. It would be that scene people would show their friends and say, "Look how justice sometimes actually works." The next hour was procedural and necessary. Social workers arrived, documented the conditions of the room, interviewed the girls using specialized methods, photographed the mattresses, the e-stim equipment, the falsified medical records. Elise had prepared everything so meticulously that each piece of evidence fit perfectly into the next. There were no gaps. There was no room for denial. But then came the moment when the girls had to leave that house. A social worker, a woman with the kind of face that had seen a lot of pain and yet kept functioning, approached Elise. "Are you Elise?" she asked. "Yes." "The girls want to stay with you." Elise shook her head. "They can't," she replied, "but they trust you. They love you. You two could—" "I have an aunt," interrupted a voice from the room, weak but clear. It was Claire, using her muscles to make the sound she had spent years trying to make. "Aunt Mary. She always wanted to take care of us. Parents wouldn't let her. But now..." Elise had discovered Aunt Mary 3 months ago, had contacted her in secret, had prepared everything for this moment. Aunt Mary was a woman who had raised her own children with love, who had space in her house and in her heart for 2 children who needed to learn what affection was. "Aunt Mary is coming," said the social worker, checking her tablet. "She should be here in 20 minutes. Elise helped the girls get ready, combed Claire's hair, chose clothes that weren't white, that weren't clinical, that were colors of life. Sophie wore a green dress. Claire wore a blue one. When Aunt Mary arrived, she ran. Literally ran up the stairs and fell to her knees before the mattresses where her nieces lay. "My babies," she said. "My girls." There was nothing performative in that crying. It was real. It was that kind of crying that comes from a place where love had been blocked from flowing, but was finally being released. Elise stepped back, left the girls with their aunt. Let the news camera document the hug. Let the world see that there was recovery after cruelty. There was love after abandonment. The social workers took Claire and Sophie in Aunt Mary's arms. Elise didn't accompany them. Her work was complete. Justice wasn't something she owned now. Justice belonged to the systems that slowly, very slowly, would begin to process what Robert and Vivian had done. They would be tried. They would be convicted. They would be imprisoned. The news of the parents who tried to kill their daughters for insurance would spread through the city like a poison, preventing other families from repeating the same mistake. Elise left the house that night, went back to the small room she rented, and for the first time in many months, she slept. 6 months later, Elise was working at a small community center in a neighborhood the police barely visited. She taught physical therapy to children no one else wanted to help. Poor children, disabled children, children the system had abandoned. She had recovered her license. There was a new regulator who was less influenced by rich doctors. The investigation into the previous case had been reopened. The truth had emerged, and Elise's career had been restored. Not because anyone was generous, but because the truth was stronger than money. Her scene with Claire and Sophie had gone viral. She had received messages from people all over the country. Job offers, offers to be famous. Elise had refused them all. She just wanted to work, just wanted to help. One day, while she was with a patient, her assistant called her. "You have a video call," she said. "They said it's important." Elise took the tablet, answered. On the screen, 2 girls appeared. They weren't those girls trapped on mattresses in a white room anymore. They were in a simple but cozy therapy room with walls painted in warm colors. There were toys. There was light. "Hi, Elise," said Claire. "Still weak?" still needing to work hard to make the sounds come out, but real. Completely real. "Hi, girls," replied Elise, and her entire face changed. The hardness disappeared. The weight disappeared. Only a woman seeing the result of her work remained. "We have a surprise," said Sophie. The camera pulled back, revealed a physical therapy assistant behind the girls, hands resting gently on their shoulders. "Sophie is going to try something," said the assistant. And then very slowly, with tremors coming from muscles that were learning to work again, Sophie raised her hand. Her arm shook. Sweat appeared on her forehead, but she lifted it, and with her index finger extended, she touched the screen where Elise's face was. A hand touching a screen. A child who months ago had almost died, now moving her own body, now establishing voluntary contact. It wasn't a miracle. Miracles were final. This was the beginning. This was the first step of a long recovery. A recovery based on love, not profit. A recovery that would take years. A recovery that would be made with patience, with humanity, with the knowledge that every movement had been stolen from them, but was now being returned, inch by inch, gesture by gesture. Elise places her hand against the screen, mirroring Sophie's touch. "I am so proud of you," she said. And in that moment, the story of a nanny who had come to that house by chance, or maybe not by chance, was complete. It wasn't a story with a perfect ending. It was a story with a real ending. An ending where justice wasn't instant, but it was certain. Where redemption wasn't easy, but it was possible. Where love, even that which had been impeded by months of cruelty, could finally grow. This story taught us that justice can arrive slowly, but it arrives. That children who were neglected need people who believe in them. That the true miracle isn't the instant cure, but the determination of two girls to reclaim their lives, one movement at a time. If you like emotional stories like this, stories that show there is still hope in a world full of cruelty, subscribe to the channel to become part of our family. Here we share stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things. Stories about how kindness still exists. Stories about how a touch, a gesture, a life dedicated to helping can change everything.